Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 181 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 25 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. Today, I discuss why I think game balance is important. We often think of game balance when coming up with campaign affecting house rules, but I think we should also keep it in mind when making rulings on the fly during play. These spontaneous house rules can have just as much impact on your game as the ones you spend all that time designing and thinking about and tinkering with. But before we get into our main topic today, have a few announcements and short little things I want to talk about here at the top of the show. First of all, I want to remind you that over at StarwalkerStudios.com, you can get a hold of Game Master's Journey t-shirts and other paraphernalia. You can also check out my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. Thank you very much for everyone who's purchased the adventure. I really appreciate your support. And thank you for everyone who's gotten t-shirts. I also appreciate your support. If you get a t-shirt, snap a picture of yourself with it and tweet it to me or email it to me. I'd love to see the shirts out in the wild. Also want to remind you that we now have a Discord server that you can join and talk with other listener GMs, and we have a Google Plus community. So a couple great ways that you can connect with other GMs and trade stories and advice and questions and all that good stuff. So this is episode 181 of the show. This is the final episode for season 10 of Game Master's Journey, but don't worry, I'll be back. Got a lot of fun things planned for season 11. Also want to let you know and remind you that we have another live stream coming up. That will be next Wednesday on October 4th at 3 p.m. Pacific time. So I do these live streams once a month. I do it the first Wednesday every month, 3 p.m. Pacific. And I just get on the stream for an hour and talk about something RPG related. And we have a chat room where you can join in and ask questions or suggest topics to talk about. And I have a lot of fun speaking with listener GMs during the live stream. So if you can make it, definitely come join in. And even better, come with a question or a topic idea or feedback on the show or anything that you'd like to let me know. So again, that's next Wednesday, 3 p.m. Pacific. And I hope you'll join us. Also, I am going to be starting a new D&D campaign very soon, planning to start that in the second week of October. And this is going to be my Hinterlands of Alandria campaign that I've been talking about so much in season 10. This is going to be an exploration-based campaign, pulling some techniques and inspirations from Wes March's type campaigns. It's going to be in my homebrew setting of Primordia. We're starting at first level. We're going all the way to 20th level and even beyond. And I am really excited to get this started. It came to my realization recently that when I look at my YouTube channel, and I look at all the actual plays I have on my YouTube channel, the vast majority of them are me running published adventures, which is kind of funny because I have relatively little experience running published adventures. By far, the majority of my GMing experience has been running my own adventures of my own creation and my own settings. And so it's kind of unusual that anyone that might want to wonder, well, what's Lex like as a GM is most likely going to find a video of me running some published adventure. And, it's very different. I think it's very different skill sets involved with running a published adventure versus running your own adventure. And I personally find running my own adventures ultimately easier and a lot more fun. And to the point that I feel like I'm not nearly as effective or good of a GM when I'm running a published adventure as I am when I'm running my own thing in my own setting. And that's both running a published adventure and that's also running in a published setting. So I much prefer my own adventures, my own settings, and I feel like I'm a better GM when I'm doing that. So I'm really excited to get back to my roots with this campaign and to run in my own setting, my own adventure of my own creation, and also finally getting to play test various house rules and systems that I've come up with to use in my Primordia campaigns to give campaigns in Primordia, a little bit of a different feel than campaigns in other settings. And I firmly believe and am very much in the camp of thought that what we're given in Dungeons and Dragons or really any RPG that you play is just the launching off point. It's not the end all be all. For instance, in D&D, the spells that we have in the player's handbook and the other sources aren't the only spells that exist in D&D, aren't the only spells that exist in whatever world you're using, or they shouldn't be. Instead, they represent the most commonly known spells, the most commonly used, kind of the generic spells, if you will. But again, just continuing with the spell example, most good spellcasters that are of a decently high level of just level and proficiency and skill, I think are going to develop their own spells that are personal to them. And, as a spellcaster, you might learn some spells from your mentor that were spells that he or she developed that are personal to them. So, I think in a really well-developed D&D setting, you should be encountering spellcasters using spells you've never seen before, because everybody's going to have kind of their own thing going on. So I very much believe that what we're given in the rules is just the beginning and should not be the end or the entirety of what we as game masters use in our games. So something that's very important to me and something that is part of what I really enjoy about being a game master is adding my own flair to whatever game I'm running. And this is pretty relevant today because later in the episode, I'm going to be talking about house rules and game balance and some things to consider and keep in mind. And so I'm all for house rules. And I know sometimes on the show, it can kind of sound like I'm anti house rules. I'm not. I'm all for house rules. And I think that's what D&D is all about. That's what D&D has been all about all the way back to the beginning in 1974. It's always been about GMs coming up with their own content, their own adventures, their own monsters, their own magic items, their own spells, their own classes, their own feats, whatever, coming up with everything, right? Just using what we have from Wizards of the Coast, or before them TSR, as the beginning, not the end. I feel like I probably already said that. So I'm all for house rules, and I think that they are a great way to customize your game, not only for, this is what it's like to play D&D under Lex Starwalker, but also this is what it's like to play D&D in Primordia, using these house rules to make Primordia different and to say, well, these things are happening because this is Primordia and things are different here than other places. So the mechanics of the game that we're playing reflect that. So I've been working on a lot of stuff for Primordia, and I haven't really tested any of it yet. So this campaign is going to be a lot of homebrewed stuff being tested. I'm coming up with mystery cults. So mystery cults are just simply super secret organizations that are devoted to pursuing the mysteries, the deeper mysteries of one of the gods. So the idea is in Primordia, there are 18 gods. So there is a mystery cult devoted to each of the 18 gods. And these are organizations that player characters can join and become part of. And by advancing in ranks within these mystery cults, they can actually get access to additional abilities, like spell-like abilities that they can use. And so that's one thing. I'm going to ultimately have 18 different mystery cults. But if you've listened to this show very long, you know that I'm a strong proponent for just preparing what you need right now first. And so right now I'm focusing on the mystery cults that I need for the specific player characters that I have. But as time allows, I will develop the rest of them. And I have other house rule stuff I want to use too. I have some new types of weapon and armor I'm implementing, various new magic items, new spells. I have whole new systems, and I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything in the campaign for people that are going to play or people that are going to watch the live streams of them. So I don't want to spoil by telling you what all these new systems are, but there are quite a few of them, and most of them are ways that player characters can gain new abilities, can gain resources, magic items, money, actual, spell-like abilities and other abilities and connections in the world and all these things, ways that they can gain those things above and beyond their character class and their background. And these are things that players will be able to get for their characters chiefly through role playing and what they choose to do with their characters. So undergoing specific quests and doing specific deeds for specific people or groups of people, and will be a way that you can, quote, advance your character above and beyond experience and levels and all that stuff. And will also be, some of them will be ways that you can, again, kind of broaden. I talked in a recent episode about this idea of stepping on other people's toes, and how in 5th edition, one of the design philosophies is we want players to have multiple options in how they can realize a given character concept and not just one. So these additional systems give yet more options that characters can realize certain concepts. So for instance, if a player wants to have their character have some maybe minor healing ability, well, in addition to all the normal ways you could do that, there's now the possibility of joining a mystery cult and advancing through the ranks of that through performing quests and deeds, giving offerings, and role playing, and getting access to some of those abilities that they might want without having to multi-class into cleric or play a paladin or take a feat or something like that. So I'm really excited to run this campaign. And most of the players have, if not made their characters at this point, have pretty solid ideas what they're playing. I've started doing preludes for everyone, which is it's almost like kind of just splitting the session 0 into a session 0 for each player, basically is what it is. We handled most of the actual session 0 stuff on our forum, but then I'm getting together with each player for about an hour just to go over their character, their backstory, answer any questions they have, figure out, how their character ties into the world. And I think it's an important thing to do. And I think it's especially important running in a homebrewed setting as I am, especially a relatively new one, because the players don't know much about my setting. So, if you're going to play in Forgotten Realms, you can find buttloads of information on Forgotten Realms. But if you're playing in Primordia, unless you want to listen through all the podcast episodes and piece together what's what that way, you really don't know. And even that isn't ideal because I've made so many revisions. So I think it's important, to do a prelude. And I think it's even more important with an online game because it's just so much more difficult when you're playing online using something like Discord or Google Hangouts. It's just more difficult to give each player their individual time to kind of flesh out their character and their backstory and stuff. It's just a lot easier to do it individually in private hangouts or Discord meetings or whatever. So yeah, it's something I got the idea of doing preludes from Vampire and Changeling, and I always did them in those games. But I haven't done them in 5th edition. And I'm really glad I decided to do it, because I feel like, at least the ones I've done so far, I feel like the player's more grounded in their character's place in the world. And also, just as importantly, maybe even more importantly, I feel like I have a better understanding of who this character is and what the player's looking for as far as what they want to see with their character and from the campaign. And that's something else I've noticed, for whatever reason, when playing online, it's been more difficult for me to really get to know the player's various characters and where they want to go with those characters. So having these one-on-one sessions at the beginning to flesh that out has been really helpful. So as of now, it looks like our first session for that will be on Tuesday, October 10th. We're going to be playing on Tuesdays, and we play from 5 to 8 Pacific time. So I will stream those games on my YouTube channel. So definitely come watch if you can. And they will be, available later on my YouTube channel if you can't see it live. And I'm also probably going to grab some of the prelude stuff and edit that together so that you can have the information about the characters that we came up during the preludes. I may not have that available right away at the very beginning of the campaign, but the plan right now is to do that at some point. So we will be streaming it. And something else that's very relevant to this show that I want to talk about is I've decided to do something different with this campaign. Like I said, I've streamed quite a few campaigns on YouTube now. Most of them have been pre-published stuff. And way back when, I did a series of episodes on this show and on GM Intrusions, where I came up with a Numenera campaign, the Obsidian Monolith, and I talked about how I came up with that campaign. I live streamed that, and that's on my YouTube. And would talk about, in the Obsidian Monolith episodes of the podcast, would talk about, things that happened and kind of the design process of the campaign. And that was extremely popular series of episodes. And also the world building episodes I've done on Game Master's Journey have also been very popular. And I'm constantly getting requests from listeners to talk more about my games, to talk more about how I prepare for sessions, how I prepare for campaigns, and all that stuff. And I think that the best way to do that is to talk about a campaign I'm actually running. The only kind of hiccup there is I don't want to spoil it for the players, and I don't want to spoil it for people who are actually watching the campaign. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce a series of YouTube shows that are going to be basically commentary on this campaign. Some of them I may make an episode right before I run a session and say, this is what I'm planning for this session. This is, what I've prepared for and how I'm going to approach it. And then I may also do sometimes record episodes after a session to say, well, this is what happened in the session. This is how things went. This is what happened that was unexpected and how I dealt with it. Here are any issues that came up and how I dealt with them. And what I would really love to do is have a Q&A right after the session. But unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that because I have to go to work right after the session. But what I may do is the day after I live stream a game, I may have a Q&A where people can come in and ask questions about the campaign and what's going on. I don't know. We'll just have to see how it pans out. But the plan is I'm going to make these YouTube episodes kind of DM commentary of the campaign, kind of behind the scenes commentary. And I'm just going to sit on those until we get to a point in the campaign where whatever I talked about in that given YouTube episode isn't going to be a spoiler. And then once that comes about, then I'll start releasing those commentaries. And I may put that into the podcast stream as part of the podcast, or it may just be a thing on YouTube. So you can let me know, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, if you'd prefer that those be part of the podcast stream or not. I'm still debating how to do that. But I'm going to do that because I think that there's a lot that happens at the table that, you know, especially as someone who's been GMing for quite a while, I kind of do and don't think about. And so there's probably a lot that I could talk about that it never occurs to me to talk about because it's just stuff that just kind of happens in the flow of the game at the table. But if I can record these episodes fairly recently after I run a session and kind of talk about what happened, then maybe I can tease out some of that stuff that it doesn't occur to me to talk about. And I think it will be very helpful to any of you who are wanting to learn from this, to be able to actually watch the sessions themselves, watch the actual play, and then hear commentary and my response to questions about what happened and things like that. I think that'll be a great way to approach this for those of you who want to know more about how to run games at the table and session prep and just, you know, GM tricks of the trade and all that good stuff. So I'm really excited about the campaign. I'm really excited about doing this kind of campaign journal or DM diary or behind the screen DM commentary, or I don't know what I'm going to call the thing, but I'm really excited to do both of them, and hopefully it will be helpful to you, and hopefully it will be entertaining as well. All right, so this is the part of the show where I start talking about our main topic. And today, our main topic is the importance of game balance. And this is something I think I've talked about once or twice on the show before. But today, I want to approach this topic of game balance, which is a huge topic. I want to approach it from the point of view of house rules and rulings on the fly that we do during the course of play as a GM. So I mentioned game balance quite a bit on the show because it is something that I think is really important. And it is one of those things that I think can be more difficult for newer GMs and even can seem unimportant to newer GMs. It's one of those things that, at least in my experience, I've found the more I run games, the more experience I get with being a game master, the more that I understand not only that game balance is important, but why it's important and how it's important. So just knowing that it is important isn't terribly useful to us as GMs, but if we can start to understand why it's important and how it's important, then that's something useful that we can apply to our games. So when I think about game balance, I basically see two main types of game balance or two things to consider when you're thinking about your game that you're running and keeping things balanced. So the first of these is the balance between the player characters and the game itself, the NPCs in the game, the monsters or creatures in the game, the world and setting, and everything, all the mechanics of the game as a whole. So, you know, at first glance, this type of balance, this balance between the player characters and the rest of the game, can seem really not to matter. Especially, you know, if you're a newer GM, it can kind of seem like, well, who cares? Who cares if there's balance between the player characters and the rest of the game? So let's say I'm playing D&D, and let's say I make my player characters really powerful, much more powerful than what the game is assuming. So maybe I'm using some crazy dice rolling method to generate their ability scores that's going to lead to much higher scores than the standard array. Or maybe I'm using point buy, but I'm giving them a bunch more points to spend. Maybe I'm handing out super powerful magic items sooner than what the game recommends. Or maybe I'm just coming up with a bunch of house rules and new systems that greatly increase the capability of the player characters. So a lot of GMs, especially less experienced GMs, will think, well, who cares? It doesn't matter, because if I'm kind of boosting all of the player characters relatively equally, I'm buffing them all equally, then they're still going to be balanced with one another. And that's really all that matters. Who cares if they're more powerful than the folks at Wizards or whoever publishes your game assumes that they are? Who cares? What does that matter anyway? That the players are going to have more fun because their characters are more powerful and they can do more things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it can seem like it doesn't matter and it's not something we even need to worry about. And I know at least some GMs look at it that way. They're like, I don't worry about game balance because I don't care if my player characters are overpowered or underpowered compared to what my game assumes. I don't care. I don't think it matters. Now, I do think that of the two types of game balance we're going to discuss today, this is the less important of the two. The second type, which we'll discuss in a minute, which I already kind of briefly mentioned, is the balance among the player characters themselves, which I think is much more important than this first type, the balance between the player characters and the rest of the game. But it is still important. You can save yourself a lot of time as a GM, a lot of headaches and a lot of work and a lot of retconning if you understand how the player characters are balanced with the rest of the game in your game of choice. And, I usually advocate for not house ruling or not adjusting or fiddling with the rules until you really understand them, and not just understand how they work, but why they are the way they are. What's the design intent behind the rules? Why are the rules the way they are? What's the point? Until you understand that, chances are good you're going to create a lot of problems for yourself if you try making adaptations to the rules. So I always encourage newer GMs to really learn your system and really understand the rules before you start making changes. So any game that you play, and we'll use D&D for our example, but any game that you play makes assumptions about what player characters can do, what they can handle, basically how powerful they are, how capable they are. So for example, D&D makes assumptions based on the player character's level. Okay. So at a given character level, the game assumes a certain average number of hit points, certain average armor class, certain attack bonus, certain good and bad saving throw bonuses, specific spell save DCs, and certain damage output. Also, and this is an interesting and important point to make here, in 5th edition, the system of Dungeons and Dragons assumes that the player characters have zero magic items. And that's important. And we'll come back to that. So the game makes certain assumptions. So if you're running a level or a group of first level player characters, the game assumes they have a certain number of hit points, a certain armor class, certain bonuses to their rolls, and things like that. And the game is built around this so that when you go to design an encounter or something like that, and the game gives you some advice as far as, this is what your player characters can handle and what not, that advice is at least somewhat helpful to you, because the assumptions that the game is making about your specific player characters are, for the most part, true and accurate. So the main issue with deviating from these assumptions too far, and you can go either direction, either making the characters less powerful than the assumption or more powerful than the assumption, the possible issue with that is that it can make your encounter design more difficult and a much more complicated process. So for example, in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, we have 2 different guidelines for building encounters. We have the guidelines given in the Dungeon Master Guide, which uses an XP budget. We also have a different set of guidelines given in the Unearthed Arcana, which uses charts to kind of show you how many monsters of a given CR a given character can handle. Now, whichever of these systems you use, if you use one of them, those guidelines and the conclusions that you draw from them will become less and less relevant to your specific group, your specific situation, will become less and less useful and helpful to you the more that you stray from that baseline, the more you stray from those assumptions about the player characters. So if your player characters are far more powerful than what the game assumes, those encounter building guidelines aren't going to be much use to you at all. If they're far less powerful, same thing. And again, I want to note here and remind us that in D&D, the game assumes that the player characters don't have any magic items. So not only can you stray from the baseline assumption of the game by adding house rules or new systems or things like that, you can also depart from that baseline by giving out magic items. Now, if you stick with the guidelines in the DMG as far as how powerful of items to give characters and when to give them and things like that, it's probably not going to have a huge impact to the point where any encounter building guidelines are no longer useful to you. But on the other hand, if you're giving out items that are far beyond what the game is suggesting, for instance, giving legendary items to first level characters, then that could have a large impact and could make it so that your encounters are much more difficult to design, at least if you're going for a certain challenge level, or if you want to have some idea of, is this encounter going to be a complete pushover or is it going to be deadly serious? So let's say you gave legendary weapons to your first level party, you would see the characters hitting well above their weight class. They would be hitting armor classes that characters at that level normally wouldn't hit so often, and they're going to be doing more damage than characters of that level would normally do. Now, what's interesting about this is although offensively, they're going to be hitting quite a bit above their weight class or their level, defensively, they're going to have they're going to have values that are what the game expects. So their hit points, their armor class, their save bonuses, all those defensive attributes are going to be what a first level character would normally have. So offensively, they're going to be hitting way above their weight class. Defensively, they're going to be about where they should be. So another way to say it is offensively, they're going to be very overpowered. And defensively, they're going to be at the baseline. So I hope that you can see how that alone would make designing encounters more complicated and more challenging. In order to truly challenge this group of characters without just wiping them out, you'd need to come up with an encounter that can take hits like a higher CR encounter or creature, but does damage like a lower CR encounter or creature. And, quickly you get into the realm of not only can I not use my encounter building guidelines to help me decide how to do this, but also now a lot of times the stock monsters in the game or NPCs in the game aren't going to work. I'm going to have to homebrew my own monsters and NPCs because I need monsters that have way more defensive capability than they do offensive or whatever the case may be, depending on in what ways your player characters are overpowered or underpowered. So let's say, you're giving out legendary items to a low level party. The more of those items you give out, the worse this is going to get. It just amplifies this effect. Or if this is happening through house rules, the more house rules you add, the more this could be affected. So if you throw your game out of balance in this first way, maybe you give a bunch of powerful items to your player characters, or you give them some ability that they normally wouldn't have in the game or whatever, you're going to make more work for yourself, most likely. It will probably cause you headaches, and you'll probably eventually come to regret doing it, at least some of it. But Other than that, it's probably not going to impact your game that much. Specifically, it's not going to impact your players' experience at the table that much. At least it won't if you're able to adapt and adjust your encounters properly. If you're able to kind of figure out what you've done and how to mitigate it and adjust to it and adapt to it. If you can do that well, then the players will still have fun, and maybe they might even have more fun because their characters are super powerful or whatever. So really the biggest problem with breaking the balance in this way, assuming you can handle the consequences and deal with those mechanically, the biggest problem is going to be to you personally as a GM and the amount of hassle it is preparing encounters. It's not so much going to affect the players as long as you can pull it off. So if, on the other hand, you can't find that sweet spot where you find that balance, then the players will have less fun if encounters tend to be way too easy because they're overpowered, or they're way too hard because the player characters are underpowered, or because you tried to compensate for overpowered characters and you went too far. So, that's the one way I could see this really impacting things on the player side, is if you're not able to keep things in balance, and it's either there's no challenge and it's boring, or it's way too hard and it seems like they can't win and they're just going to die no matter what they do. Neither of which is a fun place to be in as a player. But again, it's totally possible that you could handle this on your end of the screen and it's seamless and the players are well challenged and there's a variety of challenges and it all works out great, but will take some effort on your part to make that happen. So the second type of kind of main category of game balance that I see is what I think is much more important and what's going to more likely cause problems at your table if you get it out of whack. Because it's not only going to ruin your day as a GM like the first one does, but it's also going to impact the fun the players are having at the table. So the second type of game balance is the balance among the player characters. Now, role-playing games are complex enough that true ideal balance between different player characters probably isn't even a real possibility. It's more an ideal that we shoot for. So you're going to have player characters that are slightly more or less capable than other player characters, and that's okay. And, I want to point out, not only can this come about through the mechanics of the game itself, like, oh, well, this class is just a little bit better than that class, but it can also come about from how the players play their characters. So maybe you have one player who plays super tactically and, is very strategic about how they play their character and the decisions they make, like, for instance, in combat. And then you have another player who doesn't really think tactically at all, but rather decides what they're going to do in combat based on what they think would be the most fun or the most funny or the most daring or heroic thing to do. So in this example, that first player's character will probably seem more powerful than the second one, even if on paper they're equal, just because the first player is playing more strategically and more tactically than the second one is. So, I don't know that we need to worry about, small disparities, because again, that could easily come about from just the way the players approach their character and could have nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the game. And I don't think, it's a big deal because players are used to that, right? Every game we play, everybody's kind of got their thing, and not everybody is necessarily completely equally capable all down the line. So players are used to that, and to some degree, that's kind of expected, I think. So I said that the first type of balance of the PCs with the rest of the game is mainly a concern for the GM. And, we'll make more work for you and we'll complicate your life as a GM. But if you do your job right, the players will never know it, and it's not going to diminish their fun, although it might diminish yours. The second type of balance, the balance between the player characters amongst each other, however, does affect everyone. It affects you as a GM and it affects all the players. So, if again, there's a slight difference, probably won't be a problem. this is actually really common, if not ubiquitous, at gaming tables. However, if there's a large disparity, if say one PC is significantly more or less powerful than the others, then that could be where you start to have a problem. If the player character is way underpowered compared to the other PCs, that player is going to start to feel like they're not contributing to the group and that their character just isn't as cool as the other characters. On the other hand, if a PC is way overpowered compared to the rest of the group, it can lead to that player getting all the spotlight or most of the spotlight, and the other players feeling like they're just along for the ride, and that the player or players with the super powered characters are getting to have all the fun and are doing everything. Like you'll hear players say things like, I'm not doing anything, or there's nothing I can do, or it doesn't matter what I do. Now, a lot of us probably realize that balance among the player characters is an important thing to think about when you're going to sit down and come up with a sweeping house rule or something you're going to design, like a new character class or a new spell or a magic item. So I guess what I mean by a sweeping house rule is the kind of house rule that you'd put in a handout and give to the players at the beginning of a session. So what are some examples of these types of house rules? For instance, saying wizards don't have to prepare spells, but can cast them spontaneously like a sorcerer. Or saying short rests take 2 hours instead of 1 hour. Or saying all player characters get maximum hit points on all of their hit dice, not just the first one. Or saying rogues can only sneak attack when an opponent is surprised or the opponent doesn't know that they're there. So these are all examples of house rules. This is not the way the game is written. These are all variants on the rules that a DM could come up with. So balance is definitely important when you're talking about these kinds of house rules. And I think that's probably obvious to a lot of us. But there's another kind of house rule in which balance is equally important that I think some GMs at least sometimes overlook. But before I get into that, let's go through these examples I just talked about and let's think about, what are the possible balance issues with these. So my first example was wizards don't have to prepare spells. They can cast them spontaneously like a sorcerer. So this is to say that as a wizard, I don't have to say, these are the spells I have prepared today. Anytime I want to cast a spell, I can cast any spell I have in my spell book as long as I have a spell slot available. So this is going to create both types of balance issues. This makes wizards more powerful compared to the other casters because they get more known spells like a cleric, but they get to choose from their entire repertoire of spells each time they cast like a bard. So there's different ways that the spellcasters are balanced among each other. You have, for instance, like a cleric or a druid, they have access to all the spells on the cleric and druid spell list, as opposed to a wizard who's slightly less powerful in that way, in that they only have access to the spells in their spell book, but the only limit to the spells in their spell book is the spells they can find and put in their spell book. And then you go to the more limited side of that spectrum where you have someone like a bard or a sorcerer who only knows a few spells, right? But then the way that it's balanced on the other axis is, well, bards and sorcerers, although they only know a few spells, they don't have to, quote, prepare them ahead of time. They don't have to decide among those spells which ones they have access to today. They have access to all of them. Where on the other side of the spectrum, the wizard and the cleric, who have access to many, many more spells, they have to choose each day which of those spells they can use that day. So to give one class like the wizard the best of both those worlds, the best of both those axes of balance, and say, well, not only does he have all the spells in his spell book, but he doesn't have to prepare them, makes them better than all the other spellcasters, which could be a problem. Also, another thing, especially when it comes to casters in D&D to keep in mind, is there are and have always been balance issues in D&D between casters and non-casters, especially at high level. So at higher levels, casters get more and more powerful compared to non-casters. So you really want to be careful anytime you're going to do something with a house rule that increases the power of casters, but not non-casters. So I predict if you made this house rule in your game and you ran numerous campaigns with it, that the longer you use this house rule with the same players, the more and more you'd see players playing wizards, and the less you'd see them playing other casting classes or even other non-casting classes. Because players are gamers, and gamers are really good at figuring out systems and what's the optimal choice. And if you make one choice, like in this example, the wizard, just hands down better than the other choices, players are going to choose that one. So in a way, you're actually limiting the options available to the players, because it's like, well, we have all these classes available, but really you want to pick wizard because it's the best one. All right, so our next example was short rest take 2 hours instead of 1 hour. So I think this is mainly the first type of balance, but it is a little bit the second too. So this slightly nerfs the player characters compared to the game's assumptions, because the game is going to assume they only need an hour to rest. You changing it to 2 hours makes them slightly weaker in that regard. But honestly, it's probably not going to matter much, if at all, because it's seldom as a dungeon master that you're using short rest mechanics for non-player characters or monsters. So there might be certain times where it makes a difference, but overall, probably not going to have a huge impact. And since it in general affects all PCs equally in that they all have the same short rest, probably won't lead to huge balance issues among the PCs, although it could, depending on your specific group makeup. So one of the balancing mechanisms in D&D 5th edition is whether a player character's abilities recharge on a short rest or a long rest. Some classes rely a lot on short rests, like the Battlemaster Fighter, where a lot or most of or all of their abilities come back after a short rest. So those classes benefit a lot from taking a short rest. They're pretty much ready to go again after a short rest. Then you have other classes that rely more on the long rest, like the wizard, where they need a long rest to get their abilities back. So a wizard and other spellcasters, they only get their spell slots back with a long rest. So, if you had a party that had a wizard and a Battlemaster Fighter in it, the Battlemaster Fighter might be fine with, let's just take a short rest every few hours and I'm good to go. I don't even need a long rest. Where the wizard is going to be like, after I use my arcane recovery the first time, short rest doesn't help me a whole lot. I really need a long rest. So depending on what character classes you have in your party, if you have characters that rely a lot on the short rest, they could be kind of buffed a bit, or I guess I should say nerfed a bit, by increasing the duration of the short rest from an hour to 2 hours. On the flip side, if you shortened it, and I think this is actually an optional rule in the DMG, if you said a short rest only takes 10 minutes, then that would buff characters like the Battlemaster Fighter that get stuff back with a short rest. Because as a Battlemaster Fighter, all I need is 10 minutes of downtime and I'm almost back to full strength as far as all my various abilities I can use. So that's something to consider. So that's an instance where this might actually affect PC to PC balance, even though at first it doesn't seem like it would. And I guess, one takeaway point from this is this does tend to be more complex than you might initially assume. And really my real main point here is that, when you're making these rulings, they can have impacts beyond what you initially think of. And sometimes those impacts can be large and far reaching. So my caution is to really think about what you're doing and make sure you know what you're doing before you do something that you might later regret. All right, so our next example was all player characters to get maximum hit points on their hit dice. So I think this is both balance types. This is going to increase the defensive power of the player characters compared with the monsters and NPCs in the game. And although not obvious, I think it can also affect balance between the PCs. And to explain this, I have to get into a little bit of math, but it's not too bad, I promise. So this may slightly increase the disparity in the total hit point values among the different player characters. Specifically between player characters that have a large hit die, like say the Barbarian with a D12, and those who have a low hit die, like say a Wizard with a D6. So let's take the two extreme examples. So if we look at the D6 hit die and the D12 hit die, and we say this is a normal campaign where we're either rolling for our hit points or we're using the average. An average, the average hit points for a D6 is 4 hit points. The average hit points for a D12 is 7 hit points. So the difference, the spread between what the Wizard would get and what the Barbarian would get is only 3 hit points. So at each level, on average, the Barbarian is getting 3 more hit points than the Wizard is. If, on the other hand, you say they get the maximum for their hit die each level, then the Wizard would get 6 hit points, the Barbarian would get 12 hit points, and that's a difference of 6 hit points, which doubles the size of that spread. So each level, the Barbarian would be getting 6 more hit points than the Wizard. Now, you compound this over 20 levels, and if you're using the average, that means there will be, the Barbarian will have 60 more hit points than the Wizard. But if you use the maximum at 20th level, the Barbarian would have 240 hit points more than the Wizard. So that's a huge difference, right? I would say 60 hit points difference in 5th edition is a pretty big difference, but 240 is insane. So yeah, so that's another great example of how something that on the surface may not seem like that big of a deal as far as a house rule goes. When you actually think about it, it's a really big deal. So my last example was saying that rogues can only sneak attack when an opponent is surprised or doesn't know they're there. So just for comparison, the actual rule is rogues can sneak attack anytime they have advantage on the attack. There's all kinds of ways anybody can get advantage on an attack roll, and rogues have additional ways that they can get advantage. For instance, if one of their allies is threatening the target, which is to say within 5 feet of them. So by the rules, there's a lot of ways that a rogue can sneak attack. So much so that the game pretty much assumes that the rogue is going to be able to sneak attack every combat. And in fact, will probably be able to sneak attack almost once every round in combat. However, if you use this house rule and you say the only time a rogue can sneak attack is when the opponent is surprised, or if the opponent doesn't know I'm there, then that greatly nerfs the rogue. It greatly reduces the amount of times they're going to get to sneak attack in a given combat, and will probably lead to the rogue normally getting only 1 sneak attack per combat, and even sometimes or even oftentimes not even getting 1 sneak attack in combat. So again, huge difference between the rogue gets a sneak attack almost every round, or at the very least gets at least 1 sneak attack every combat, versus the rogue gets at most 1 sneak attack per combat, and a lot of times won't even get that. So that's another huge difference, especially when you figure how much damage sneak attack adds and what that does to the average damage output of that character. So if you use this house rule, the rogue is going to feel super underpowered compared to what the game assumes, compared to the other player characters, especially at higher levels. So I think you can see that each of these examples leads to both types of balance issues to some degree, issues of balance between the player characters and the game, as well as issues of balance among the player characters themselves. But it's the ones that lead to a large disparity among the PCs that I think will be the more problematic of the two, and what we need to think the most about.
This is Mike Shalai, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to take a minute to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. It's because of the patrons that all the listeners of Game Master's Journey enjoy 2 bonus episodes every month. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Steve. Let's hear it for Steve. Yeah.
Yes.
The man. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. I also want to send a huge shout out and thank you to our brand new patron, Blaine. Thank you, Blaine. Thank you very much. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, getting back to house rules and game balance and foods for thought for all you GMs out there. So, you know, I've been talking quite a bit about the 2 different types of game balance that I see, and also thinking about game balance when you're coming up with these kind of sweeping house rules or systems that you're going to introduce into the game, kind of like what I'm doing with Primordia. However, these types of house rules that you come up with ahead of time and put a lot of time and thought into are just one way that we as GMs can create these imbalances within our games. Another way that we can cause these issues, and that GMs don't always, I think, consider, is how we actually make rulings during play of the game. And specifically, I think how we arbitrate spells and other abilities that the characters use, and what we allow them to do and not to do with those abilities. So this actually grew out of a question that a listener GM, Felipe, asked on our community over on Google+. And I think that what he described in his question is a great example of this kind of thing in action, and kind of show us what I'm talking about here. So in Felipe's campaign, the player characters wanted to steal a magical silver dragon skull and take it somewhere else. One of the players had the polymorph spell and thought, well, hey, I can just grab this spell or this skull and cast polymorph, and assumed that the skull would polymorph with the character and become part of their polymorph form. And you know what the player was thinking of here is the fact that the polymorph spell says that when you polymorph, any gear or equipment that you're wearing becomes part of your new form. And so the player was basically wanting to, I would say, abuse this and try to apply it to something that it was not intended to apply to, which is this dragon skull. Now, Felipe ruled that this wouldn't work. And his reasoning, and I think this is what he told the player, was that this skull was magical, and maybe even the dragon spirit is still tied to it in such a way. And so it's not just an object, and it's not going to work with the polymorph spell. And his reason for doing so, his real concern there, wasn't even a thing of game balance, but was just a question of what would be better for the story. And he thought it would be a better story if the players had to actually deal with this problem of how do we get this dragon skull out of here, instead of just snapping their fingers and the problem's gone because they use the polymorph spell. So even though I don't think Felipe was necessarily concerned about game balance or thinking about game balance, I think this is a great example for this discussion. So first of all, there is a clear answer to the question, would this work, as far as what the rules say? Now, sometimes things aren't so cut and dry, and as a GM, you have to interpret the rules. You have to decide, what do the rules really say? What did the designers really intend by this rule? And finally, how do I, as a GM of my game, want to handle it? So we often refer to this as the raw, or rules as written, which is what does the rule actually say? And usually rules are well written to say what they mean and mean what they say. And also the RAI, rules as intended. So sometimes you have to go beyond the letter of the rule, what the rule says, and think about what was the designer trying to accomplish with this rule in order to really understand the rule and decide how you finally want to interpret it yourself. So in this case, the rules as written says that when you polymorph, your gear or your equipment polymorphs with you. So, that doesn't necessarily, I think that pretty much explicitly answers the question right there, because a silver dragon skull, which by the way, is probably about the size of the player character. This is not like a chipmunk skull. This is a silver dragon's skull, and it was either adult or ancient silver dragon. So it's a big ass skull, right? That's not equipment. It's not gear. You don't wear it. You don't carry it on a sheath on your belt. It won't polymorph. To me, it's black and white, cut and dry. That's not what the spell does. However, if you're not convinced by that, or you're not sure of that, you can also think of what was the intent of the designers. And I actually know what the intent of the designers were, because Jeremy Crawford talks specifically about polymorph and wild shape in one of his Sage Advice segments of the Dragon Talk podcast. And I'll have that episode linked in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. So you don't have to take my word for it. You can listen to the story from the dragon's mouth itself. But the intent was basically, you're a player character, you want to polymorph. We don't want to deal with the hassle of you polymorph and leave all your clothes and equipment and stuff behind. And what do you do with that? We just want it to be quick and easy to deal with and play. So we just say that the things that you're wearing and carrying on you just polymorph with you, just to make it simple. That's the intent, to keep this simple, to keep it from bogging down play, and to just make it easy to use and intuitive. The intent is not to give player characters a way to steal massive objects very easily. That's not what polymorph does. It's not the intent of saying that you can take your gear with you. Again, a giant dragon skull is not gear. So rules as written, pretty clear. Rules as intended, pretty clear, I think, too. But that's not the end of the discussion. That's not the end of the consideration, because you as a GM don't have to follow the rules. You can change the rules. You can make a house rule, right? You could do whatever you want. So, it definitely behooves you to understand the rule first as it's written and try to understand the intent behind the rule if you can. But ultimately, it's still your decision. But anytime you're going to change a rule in the game, you should probably consider the consequences. What effects is this going to have on my game above and beyond what's going to happen in this particular moment, in this particular scene? So right now, in this example, we know what the effect of letting the character polymorph the dragon skull is going to have. They're going to be able to get out of there with the dragon skull probably much more easily than they would have otherwise, perhaps bypassing entire parts of the story that Felipe had planned around them getting the skull out of there. Maybe they were going to have to solicit help from an NPC or get a wagon to load it on or something, right? And maybe Felipe had some encounters, whether social or otherwise, built around that, that the characters are going to completely bypass. So that's the immediate effect, pretty easy to see. But we also want to think about, well, what's the effect beyond this scene, beyond this session? What kind of impact is this going to have on the rest of the campaign? So let's think about that. Let's think about the consequences of allowing this idea to work. And understanding that by doing this, we are setting a new precedent for what polymorph can do. We're basically expanding what can be done with the spell. And suddenly, in doing so, a whole host of new possibilities open up. Also, as a player, once you've gotten the GM to bend on what a spell can do this far, you figure, I can get them to bend a little more. So chances are good, you're periodically going to have players trying to do more and more with polymorph, even farther beyond what it's intended. And eventually, You're going to have to draw a line in the sand somewhere and say, no farther. I'm not letting Polymorph do any more broken things. So really by because some GMs might think, well, if I just give the player what they want in this instance, that'll be the end of it. No, that's just the beginning. That won't be the end of it. What would be the end of it is saying the spell does what the spell says it does. End of story. If you want it to do something else, research a new spell, which is how I usually handle stuff like that when the player is trying to do something with a spell or an ability that it explicitly is not able to do. I'm not talking about letting players use some creativity with how they use their abilities. That's fine. But these abilities have limitations. There is a defined, this is what it does, this is what it does not do. If a player wants to be creative in how they do what it does, I'm all for that. But if they want to, quote, creatively get it to do something it doesn't do, no. You can't make a boat an airplane just because you want it to be, right? Boats don't fly, they float. So first thing to think about, Polymorph, if we do this, Polymorph is now, I think, significantly more powerful compared to other 4th level spells. This is why my first response to this kind of thing personally would be, again, to tell the player that it's not going to work because the spell, that's not what the spell does. The spell clearly states what it does, and that's not what it does. However, you could research a higher level version of Polymorph that maybe could do that. Maybe. So that's the first possible issue is now this one 4th level spell is better than all the other 4th level spells. So guess what? You'll probably see a lot more people taking Polymorph in the future in your campaign. Second possible problem, casters who have access to Polymorph have now gotten a power increase compared to the other casters that don't have access to Polymorph, and even more of a power increase compared to the non-caster characters. Remember that we should always be careful of a rule that increases caster power and doesn't increase non-caster power, because there's already a disparity there, which is why it kind of bothers me as a player, but is why, like, for instance, playing a cleric, there are certain levels where I don't get any new spell slots at all. That doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem fair. It seems like every level I should at least get one more spell slot, but sometimes I don't. And the reason why is because casters are already crazy powerful compared to melee characters or non-caster characters. So in order to curb that somewhat, we tone down the number of spell slots that you get compared to previous editions. You also don't get additional spell slots for having a high ability score. So another great example of this, and something I've seen quite a bit in my groups and other groups, is the Control Water spell. This is a great spell that players will try to do all kinds of things with Control Water that Control Water doesn't do. I've seen so many people try to do or succeed in doing things with Control Water that are far beyond the scope of what the spell actually does. One of the classics that I've seen numerous times is trying to use Control Water to somehow affect a water elemental, assuming that, well, the spell is called Control Water, and this is a water elemental, so it should control it, right? Well, there's more to a spell than the name. You got to read the entire spell, not just the name. So yeah, and when you actually read Control Water and what the spell says it doesn't do that. It flat out does not do that. The spell targets, quote, freestanding water, which in game terms would be an object, while an elemental is not freestanding water. It's a creature. In D&D, there's object and creature are discrete, specific things. A spell can affect one and not the other. So Control Water does not affect creatures. So it doesn't matter that it's a water elemental. It's a creature. Control Water does not affect creatures. Or something else you'll see is a player wanting to use Control Water to do something with something that, quote, has water in it, like blood or wine or whatever. Let's face it, there's water in practically everything. Not only does this display a disturbing lack of understanding of chemistry, it's also not what the spell does. The spell is Control Water. It controls freestanding bodies of water. It does not control things with water in it. It does not control things with water in it. There's a huge difference between water and wine, between water and blood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the point that I really want to make here is that there may be more to consider than what we're necessarily thinking of at that moment in these situations where these things come up at the table, where a player wants to do something with an ability that the ability doesn't do that. And again, I'm not talking about places where it's open to interpretation, although this does apply, because if you're going to interpret it, you want to think about game balance too. But what I'm specifically talking here is when it very clearly does not do that thing. And you're wondering, well, should I make a house rule and say, well, in my campaign, control water does affect water elementals, or you can polymorph large inanimate objects with yourself when you polymorph. So yeah, I guess it's the same either way, whether you want to house rule that or you're deciding how to interpret an ability, you want to think about the impacts above and beyond that specific moment. I think also as GMs, we often feel that we should reward and encourage player creativity. And some GMs will make that argument and say, well, you should just let them do it because you should reward player creativity and they're being creative. However, I like to point out that D&D and other RPGs are games. They're role-playing games. They're not just improvisational storytelling. They're games. And part of games is having rules. If there's no rules, it's not a game. And I also like to point out that you can very creatively cheat. It's still cheating. It doesn't suddenly become not cheating just because you were creative about it. In fact, I would say most cheating is probably creative. That's how you get away with it, right? So, a lot of times we will hear some advice from improvisational comedy and improvisational acting, which is the classic say yes, right? Always say yes. That's pretty much always great advice for improvisational comedy. It is not always great advice for running an RPG. Yeah, sometimes say yes can be great advice for running an RPG, but not always, not in every situation, not all the time. Again, there's more to consider here than will my decision make this player happy right now? There's more to it than that. Or will my decision encourage or discourage creativity from this player? There's more to it than that. Now, if you're talking improvisational comedy, those two things aren't a concern. In fact, all we want to do is encourage creativity. We want to keep the skit going. We don't have to worry about making players happy. We're just worrying about entertainment. There's no game aspect. There's no rules aspect. So yeah, sure, say yes. But it's apples and oranges. Again, with an RPG, we're playing a game, and games have rules. Now, players are notorious. They're known for thinking in the short term. Their thinking tends to limit to what's going on right now as far as the campaign, and for thinking of their characters and from their character's point of view. How does this affect my character? That's the player perspective, which is as it should be. That's fine. That's your job as a player, is to look at the world through your character's eyes. So the player asking to use polymorph to steal Dragon Skull and the player wanting to use control water on an elemental are trying to find solutions to the problems in front of them. They're not necessarily trying to cheat or trying to pull one over on the GM. They have an obstacle. They're trying to overcome it. They're brainstorming possible solutions and throwing them out at you at the GM and say, hey, could this possibly work? They're probably not thinking about game balance. They're probably not thinking about what impact this is going to have, whether you allow it or don't allow it, on the rest of the group and the rest of the campaign. They're not thinking about, oh, this might make my character too powerful and the other players will resent me. Or they're not thinking, oh, this could lead to a lot of headaches for the GM later in the campaign. Like, they're not thinking about that because they're not a GM. Thinking about those things is the GM's job. It's not the player's job. But again, it's the GM's job. So as GMs, we need to think about these things. So obviously, it can be hard, even impossible, as a GM to anticipate and predict and know all the possible consequences of house ruling a spell or an ability on the fly so that it does significantly more or less than what the rules say it does. It can be difficult to think of all the ways it will affect balance among the player characters. These things take consideration and thought and time, And these are all things you don't have time for at the table in the middle of a combat or in the middle of a social interaction or whatever you're doing. So that's why when I'm running the game in the middle of a session, I tend to follow the rules whenever possible. I tend not to make house rules on the fly during play. Now, if something like this came up in play, and let's say I thought that polymorph should let the player do that. I don't, but let's say I did, I would still rule it the way the spell says it works. But later, after the session is over, I would think about it and think about, maybe is this something I want to change in the future? And maybe next week come up and say, hey, I've decided I will let this thing with polymorph work in the future. And I found that more often than not, when I give myself to think about these things, I eventually realize the reason it doesn't do that, the reason why that would cause problems, and I decide not to do the thing. So during play, spells do what they say they do. Abilities do what they say they do. They tend to be very well written and very clear in what they do and what they don't do. Again, if I do want to consider a change, the time to do that is in between sessions, not in the middle of a session. And I give myself lots of time to think about it. And I will also often solicit feedback from the players. Hey, I'm considering this house rule. What do you guys think? Do you foresee any possible problems with this? What do you think? All before implementing such a change. Players may not be super good at seeing ways that something makes their character overpowered. Good players will, and they'll tell you, the team players. But most players are pretty good at spotting a nerf from a mile away. So if you're considering a house rule that inadvertently is going to nerf one of the player characters and you share it with the players, there's a good chance that player will be like, hey, wait, this is kind of going to screw me over, right? So I really recommend discussing with the players any house rules you're considering. So as usual on this show, I am not trying to tell you how to run your game. You run your game however you want. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm also not saying don't make house rules. I'm not even saying don't make house rules on the fly during play. What I am saying is think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. Think a few moves ahead of where you're at. If you don't feel like you have a handle on all the permutations and all the consequences in that moment at the table, then I recommend sticking with the rules of the game you're playing. Especially if we're talking D&D 5e, but this is, at least to some degree, I think true for most, if not all games. We know at least 5e has been extensively play tested by thousands of people. Pretty much all games these days, I think, unless it's like some really tiny indie game, has been play tested by more people than you're going to have at your table. Than the play testing experience is going to be far more collectively than your experience as a GM, your experience with this particular game. So when you have to make snap judgments on the fly, I suggest you trust that process. You trust the design and the play testing and the reiterations that have been applied to your game. Trust that. Trust that the people who made the game are pros. They're probably pretty good at what they do. They probably know what they're talking about. And they just might have a better grasp of their game than you do. I know that's probably anathema saying that to GMs, but the designers of your game just might possibly know more about the game and the possible consequences of this house rule than you do. And there probably is a good reason that the game works the way that it does and does not work the way you're considering. And it behooves you to figure out what that reason is. Now, once you figure out what that reason is, then you can say, well, I think that reason's dumb. I'm going to do this other thing. But until you figure out what that reason is, changing the rule is like, I don't know. It's like trying to fix your car without knowing the first thing about how an internal combustion engine works. It's just a really foolish thing to do, I think, if you don't understand what's going on. So my advice to you is give yourself time to consider possible changes to the rules of your game. Don't make big changes on the fly during play unless you are really solid with the design of the game. Like for instance, me, I've spent enough time with D&D 5e now, and I've spent enough time reading and listening to things by the various designers, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of not only how the system works, but the intent behind the various rules and why they work the way they do. I would probably feel fairly comfortable making a house rule on the fly if it was something fairly minor that didn't have a huge impact. But if it was something more impactful, like for instance, a spell like Polymorph that numerous characters could have access to, I'm not going to monkey with that on the fly. I'm going to give myself time to think about it and consider what I'm doing and make sure that I'm making a good decision. So that's my advice to you. Not saying don't do it. Not saying don't do it on the fly. Just be realistic of your, where you're at as far as system mastery of the game. And if you're still learning or you still don't feel like you've completely grokked it, then run it as written. See the game run as intended for a while. And I think that you'll find over time you get a much more sophisticated understanding, and you will find yourself making fewer house rules, and you'll find that the house rules that you do make work a lot better and cause you a lot less problems in the long run, which is, I think, what we're going for at the end of the day. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 181 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarwalker, and you can also call the Game Master's Journey voicemail number and leave me a message. That number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening or both, you might even hear your message on the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future topics, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey, as well as links to connect with the Game Masters Journey community on Google Plus and Discord, where you can share ideas, questions, and stories with other listener GMs. If you'd like to support the show, the best way you can help us out is by becoming a patron. You can find out all about becoming a patron at patreon.com/StarwalkerStudios. Check the bottom of the show notes for all the other ways you can support the show, including purchasing a t-shirt or my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth, at StarwalkerStudios.com, or by using my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon. However you decide to help us out, we really appreciate it. I hope you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.